Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me for the fifth installment of my series Live Bitcoin Interviews. This is the first time I'm actually being hosted here at Block TV, so thanks to everybody for hosting me. And we have here Meni Rosenfeld.
Hi.
I'll introduce Meni in a second, but before I'll just say I've been involved with Bitcoin since 2011. I'm now an active angel investor and advisor in the field. And if you want to get more emails on the upcoming episodes in the series or more interviews, then just email me or subscribe to the channel. So, hi Meni.
Hi.
Meni has been involved in Bitcoin also from 2011. We actually met at the first Bitcoin meetup ever in Israel. I found Bitcoin just shortly before. I looked on meetup.com. I saw a meetup, so I went. And in the meetup, there was me, Meni, and another guy. I think Meni remembers his name, I don't. And the other guy left after about 10 minutes. And then there were Meni and me, and that was the beginning of our relationship 8 years ago. Meni is currently the chairman and maybe the key force behind the Israeli Bitcoin Association. He did a master's degree at the Weizmann Institute. Has done several some research in the field of Bitcoin and crypto, and has been formerly headed the research at a similar group as well. So, hi Meni, how are you doing today?
Hi, fine, thanks. How are you?
Very good. So I will do a quick intro session. I always do with everybody, just some warm-up questions. Maybe some of these are a bit banal, but I just like to get them to know, your relation to Bitcoin. So when did you buy your first Bitcoin, and how did you get into the space?
Okay, so that was in March 2011. I think it's the same month that you entered the scene. And so actually I heard about Bitcoin from a website called lesswrong.com. It's a community blog dealing with rationality and related topics such as transhumanism, cryonics, friendly AI, and so on. So they are connected to a research institute it's now called a Machine Intelligence Research Institute, MIRI. Back then it was called differently. And they started accepting donations in Bitcoin. So there was a post in Less Wrong about this. And I read this post like I read many posts from Less Wrong. And that's when I first heard about Bitcoin. And I was in a pretty unusual situation. For most people, when they first hear about Bitcoin, they don't know in advance the problem it's supposed to solve. So you need to convince them that there is a problem and that Bitcoin is the solution. In my case, I already understood there is a problem. And actually, the concept of cryptocurrency, I've heard about it before I first heard about Bitcoin. In fact, it's very interesting because I wanted to take the technological digital revolution and apply it to finance and money and economics, which are things which are mostly done the same way they were always. So I had some interest in finding a technological solution for cryptographic money, and it's a shame that I didn't spend more time looking into it, because if I had, I would have heard about Bitcoin sooner. But anyway, I didn't pursue it too much, but it was in the back of my head. I was open to receiving the idea of cryptographic currency. And so I heard about Bitcoin, and very quickly I started being active in it. I will mention another thing, that back then I was also interested in the concept of monetizing computational power. So the idea being that if you have a computer that can do computations, and there are people looking to do computations, so they could outsource their computation to your computer, and you could get some payment for it. So that's a concept which back then I thought about how this could be done. So this resonated very nicely with the concept of mining in Bitcoin, where back then it was just on the transition between CPU to GPU. So whatever the case, if a month or two before I entered the scene, you could do it with the GPU. After that, you could do it now with the CPU. You could do it before. Now you can do it with GPU. Either way, if you have a computer, you can use it to make money. So I thought it was an interesting concept.
Okay, so how long did it take from you from hearing about Bitcoin for the first time to actually buying some? And later you also provided the service Bitcoin, right, to help others buy?
Yes, so I think the first thing I did was mining before I bought Bitcoins. I mined Bitcoins. I used a GPU I had at the time, which wasn't very good for the purpose. Back then, ATI GPUs were much superior for mining Bitcoin than NVIDIA. I had an NVIDIA GPU, so I mined a bit. And yeah, and before I bought my first Bitcoins, I wanted to be sure that I'm able to sell them, right? Because I see people talking about Bitcoin, and there was an exchange rate back then it was $1 per Bitcoin. And I wasn't completely convinced that it's real. I mean, just because I see some website which says one Bitcoin is $1, I was not convinced that if I have Bitcoins, I can actually get dollars out of it. So I wanted to mine some Bitcoins, sell them, and only then I was confident enough to buy. And that was a bit troublesome because back then there weren't that many good options to sell Bitcoins, and I tried selling on empty GOX, but then I found out that withdrawing the money was harder than I thought. Luckily, eventually I came across a website called CoinCard by Michael Hendricks, which allowed you to sell Bitcoins and get a payment in PayPal in return. So I did that, and it went smoothly. I mean, it took me some time to find that website, but once I did, it was a very good website. And there is a sister website also by Michael Hendricks called CoinPal, where you can buy Bitcoins for PayPal. So after I saw that I could sell Bitcoins and get PayPal payment, I went to CoinPal to buy a larger amount of Bitcoins back. And yeah, and then you mentioned Bitcoin. So like I said, I could buy Bitcoins with PayPal, and I wanted to invest in Bitcoin. Problem is that because of all the problems with PayPal, that was very expensive to do it with this website, with PayPal. So actually that's one of the main reasons I started Bitcoin, which was Israel's first Bitcoin exchange service, because what I had in mind back then, and it was completely wrong, but what I had in mind is that there are probably a lot of people in Israel who learned about mining and mined some coins, and they want to sell them. So I say that I'm willing to buy and sell Bitcoins, but I adjusted the prices so people are incentivized to sell to me. Right? So based on the exchange rate, as you could take from empty GOX at the time, convert to shekels, then I took no fee for people selling to me, and I took some fee for people buying for me. So I thought that would encourage people to sell to me, but that did not happen. People only wanted to buy. So I wanted to buy for myself, and they wanted to buy to be able to sell to others. And yeah, so I learned that I need to find some sustainable way to buy Bitcoin. So yeah, so I did what I had to do to be able to do wire transfers from my bank to empty GOX's account, started buying Bitcoins, and so on. So yeah, so that's the story about that.
Okay. I think I'll actually jump towards this day. And again, this is a question I ask everybody I interview, and you can answer in however level of specificity that you want. But generally, how does your crypto or altcoin or Bitcoin portfolio look like? Like, I assume you own some Bitcoin in that, but like, what's the percentage of Bitcoin to alts? Are there any alts that that you hold, let's say?
Well, okay, the majority is in Bitcoin. I do have some alts. I don't remember all of them, and those that I remember, I don't necessarily want to list. I do have some Litecoin, some Ether. These are, I think, the main alts.
Have you sold your all the Bitcoin forks, Bitcoin Cash, and whatnot?
So yeah, with things like Bcash, I don't care about it enough to dump it. So I still have most of the Bcash I had received when the fork did. Same for Bcash SV. I didn't touch it too much. But yeah, so I have some of those. But however you look at it, the majority is Bitcoin. And paradoxically, even though I am more interested in Bitcoin than the others, when it happens that I need some fiat currency as well, I usually sell my Bitcoins because I know how to deal with them. I have a wallet I use frequently. It's easier for me to sell Bitcoins than to sell any other alt that I don't frequently use. So maybe over time, the percentage of Bitcoin went down a bit. But yeah, like I said, majority is Bitcoin. Yeah.
Okay. And do you, I don't know, I guess two questions. Like when was the last time you actually actively bought a new coin, and what do you think of the the options of privacy coins that exist, the various privacy coins?
Well, let's see. When was the last time I bought a coin? I'm not completely sure actually. It depending on what you count, but maybe a year ago. Well, with regards to privacy coins, well, I'm not that much of a privacy buff myself, so I can see why people would want privacy coins, but I don't, for myself, really believe in the idea of privacy as something crucially important, so I'm not that bullish about privacy coins. And other than that, there's the issue of whether any of the currently existing privacy coins are actually worth anything. And I guess in that regard, probably Monero is one of the more what's the word? More reliable coins, I guess, or more noteworthy.
Okay.
So I didn't spend that much time looking into it, but what I did try to look into was pretty favorable. So maybe that's good.
So actually, maybe I'm running two lines of questioning in parallel here. So I have two follow-ups. So you said you bought a coin maybe a year ago. So I'm very curious on what you bought around that time, if you're willing to share.
Yeah, I don't really want to get into it, and that's assuming I remember exactly. But yeah, it's best not to get into that.
Okay, and on the matter of privacy coins, so do you think so? There is the question of how much privacy do people need, right? And today in Bitcoin, if I pay you for this cup of coffee, you pretty much know all my financial history. And of course, there are ways to make it harder, but ultimately, there's no bulletproof solution for that right now implemented in Bitcoin. So where do you see that? How do you see that problem being solved in the future in Bitcoin?
Yes, so in the future, then yeah, there is a concept of confidential transactions in Bitcoin, bulletproofs, and all sorts of things. Also, paying with the Lightning Network has a different privacy profile than paying with on-chain Bitcoin. So it's different and mostly better privacy. So I think there are solutions even within the current Bitcoin protocol. Definitely, if you modify it a bit. And I think that right now, humanity is not really prepared for real privacy. So I think Bitcoin, as it stands right now, offers a good privacy trade-off in relation to how humanity works at the moment. In the future, when there is more willingness to accept more privacy, then I think Bitcoin can evolve as well. And this relates strongly with the issue of regulators. And I spend a lot of time talking with regulators. Maybe we'll talk about that later too. But when I do, it's very convenient for me to be able to say that Bitcoin is not effective for money laundering because all the transactions public on the blockchain, so it's not private, it's not anonymous. Well, actually, no, it is somewhat private, it's not anonymous, but there is some tension. I mean, there's enough room to be able to work with regulators to actually stop crime. So at this point, it's important to not be completely anonymous, to have some level of accountability. But over time, it's definitely possible that, regulation will change, governments will change, and humanity as a whole will demand more privacy. And then we can, allow Bitcoin to enter the mainstream even with anonymity features.
Okay, yeah, that's a good answer. So, why do you've spent most of a large part of the last 8 years, I think, to Bitcoin, basically, to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So, why do you love it so much, or what makes you passionate about it?
Okay, so that is a multifaceted question. I think. Okay, so I do love it because it's simply something that can make the world a better place, and it's more efficient. It can allow a new economy which is more transparent and open and empowering to people. So there are a lot of things about Bitcoin which are very good, and I want to help. And like I said, this also resonated with thoughts I had even before I heard about Bitcoin. But that's only part of the story. I mean, it's in addition to my love for Bitcoin, which does exist, and my desire to promote it, which does exist, there's also the issue of comparative advantage and opportunities. So, there are a lot of other things that I am interested in and I could be promoting, but in Bitcoin, because of my history, because I'm in it deep, I think I can be more effective just based on the opportunities I have. So if I have time I want to spend to help humanity, and I can do it within the Bitcoin space, and I can do it with any other space, I think the total impact will be bigger in Bitcoin. So that's one thing. And another issue is, so it's probably not a secret that I made some profit from buying Bitcoins earlier than now, and I think that helping Bitcoin succeed is part of my repayment to the world for what I profited.
So let's say altruistic motives.
Mostly, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll touch later on the Israeli Bitcoin Association and all the work you've been doing there. Now I want to ask actually maybe the opposite question, in a way. Like, can you steelman the arguments against Bitcoin? Can you take the critics' role for a second and try to tear Bitcoin apart and explain why isn't it going to work?
Yeah, okay, so there are several challenges that we could think of. I guess, the challenges belong to several categories. You have technological challenges and economic challenges and so on. So technologically, I think the main risk for Bitcoin going forward is the very same thing which Satoshi innovated, right? The reason that we didn't have Bitcoin before Bitcoin is that nobody knew how to solve the double spending problem in a decentralized way. And Satoshi came up with the concept of a blockchain and mining and using proof of work in this regard. So that was the solution. And that's why we were able to at all talk about Bitcoin or a decentralized cryptocurrency. But the question remains, is this solution really that good? And that's, the jury is still out. So it has to do with the funding of mining and the cost to the economy. So first, there is the issue of the cost of mining, which is significant. And then, you can argue about what is exactly the cost and whether it's worth it. And I think that the cost is indeed worth it for the benefit that it gives, but it does come at a cost. It's not a free solution, right? It's not some magical innovation that Satoshi found it and that's it. You have a currency that works for free. No, it has a significant cost, and there are risks, right? If we don't spend enough resources on mining, then any day an attacker could come and do a hash rate majority attack. So there are risks, and the only way to mitigate these risks is to spend a lot of resources on mining. So there is a question of whether this is good for the economy in total. So like I said, I do believe that it is, but there is a question, and it's not completely clear. Now, even if we agree that humanity as a whole is interested in paying this cost in order to enable Bitcoin, it's not clear how to actually raise the funds for it, right? There is so right now it's easy because there are new Bitcoins generated each block, so that's a reward that incentivizes miners. So that's what allows people to spend their resources.
Okay, so you said, I'll summarize, you're saying that the economic model of mining is not yet battle-proven enough for the long run.
Yeah, but I do want to emphasize that, in a few decades from now, there will not be any significant new cost being generated. It will be based solely on transaction fees, and it's not clear what the market of transaction fees will look like.
Yep.
And there is, it depends on what restrictions there are at blocks and so on. So it's, nobody knows how exactly it will work. We hope that it will work, but we don't know.
Okay.
And it could be that the transaction fees will be too low to provide enough security from attacks, or if the transaction fees are too high, then it will be less usable. So, yeah.
What about the regulatory attack? Do you think that governments, what are the odds? Let's say if you had to give an odd in percentages between 0 and 100, what are the odds that governments will shut down Bitcoin in the majority of the world?
Well, in the very long term, I think it's close to 0, because so in the short to medium term, I don't see any indication that any developed government wants to shut down Bitcoin. If they wanted, they would have been more aggressive earlier. So it doesn't seem that they want to do it. I don't think that they will. But the thing is that even if theoretically the world governments unite and try to shut down Bitcoin, then the best they can do is put it down to the underground rights. So you will not have, shops advertising that they accept Bitcoin if it becomes illegal or something like that. But, in secret, in the underground, in cypherpunk communities, with political dissidents and so on, it will still be used, and it will be, something of a niche, something dormant, and it will wait until years or decades later where the political geoscape is more receptive for this. So governments can put it underground for a while, maybe even decades. They can't shut it down completely, or they can't shut down the vision completely if we look decades from now. So I think the whole thing with regulation, government, I think it's a very big challenge in the short and medium terms. In the long term, it's not really an issue. There is another issue that does exist in the long term, which is simply lack of interest, right? So, we think Bitcoin is great. It has all these advantages. But if people don't care about these advantages, or if they find, if they just are comfortable with the more traditional methods, then it will not have a lot of impact, right? It might be used with a few enthusiasts who appreciate it, but it will not have an actually big impact on the world and how the economy takes place. So that is, I think it is a somewhat significant risk, because there are a lot of great ideas that have popped up, and not in all of them people are interested.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a interesting vision for the future, and of course we will see how this develops. I want to ask just a couple of technical questions, maybe, or semi-technical questions. So you mentioned Lightning, right? So do you think, how is Lightning as a solution for scaling? Is it a good enough solution, or the ultimate solution, or is it still missing some key points?
Yeah, so I think something like Lightning is necessary. The basic concept on which Lightning is based is the ability to have transactions on the blockchain which represent several payments, right? So instead of every payment that I make, I need to broadcast to the whole Bitcoin network, I use a few transactions to establish a channel, and then whenever I need to make payment, I do it with a communication in a small scale with my counterparty for the channel and so on, without broadcasting it everywhere. I think something like this is necessary. It doesn't necessarily have to be the exact same design of the Lightning Network as it is, but the concept, I think it's necessary. Without it, it's impossible to scale. At least not until there are real breakthroughs in all kinds of cryptography and information theory. I do think that if theoretically in the future there will be cryptographic primitives which allow, a reliable sharding of the data, right? So, right now, every Bitcoin node needs to have full data of all transactions. If it doesn't know everything, then he has no business being a node. and yeah, without knowing everything, you can't verify that the transaction is real. Now, if we have a concept where each node only stores a piece of the data and it provides zero-knowledge succinct proofs for what he knows about the data, so a node that wants to verify that the transaction is real, it needs to collect proofs from a few nodes, add to it the knowledge he has himself, and he can get, a verification that the transaction is real.
I actually haven't heard of zero knowledge as a solution to Bitcoin scaling. Is that your idea or people
Well,
talking about it?
I'm not completely sure. Yeah, I haven't heard it being talked about a lot. I don't think I invented it. Well, the idea with zero knowledge, so zero knowledge is frequently touted as a privacy solution, which it can be, but the thing about the zero knowledge is not only that you can hide the knowledge, you also don't need to bother people with the knowledge, right? You can provide a succinct proof that something is happening without sending the whole thing. So I think this can potentially be a very powerful primitive for scalability. But the idea, as I said earlier, I think completely theoretical. The basic primitives are still not up to the task. And even if they were, the design of the system is a completely different design, which has more failure modes than Bitcoin as we know it today, right? So with Bitcoin, and if something is wrong, right, a transaction generates coins out of thin air or something like that, you can very, very easily see it, right? You see all the data, you can see this transaction, which shouldn't be real, and it provides, it generates 100 million Bitcoins, and there's a bug in the software and you can fix it. But when it's all based on zero knowledge proofs and really advanced cryptography and some things which are not even proven and so on, then there are much higher failure modes. So I don't know whether the hardcore Bitcoin users will accept such a setting, even if theoretically it's good. So yes, so that was rather long detours to say that there might be other solutions for scalability, but barring that, we do need something akin to Lightning Network, but it's not sufficient on its own, right? So I did a calculation once that even if everyone uses Lightning Network, so if we want Bitcoin to scale to the whole world, then the raw capacity of the chain needs to increase by a factor of maybe 200 from how it is now.
So that means like bigger blocks by a factor of 200,
the
rate of blocks?
Either that or that, right? In the language we use commonly, it's bigger blocks. So let's say 400 megabyte blocks or something like that. Of course, I do think there are also advantages to reducing the interval between blocks when used in conjunction with the ideas like those of Aviv Zohar, with Spectre and so on. But in simple terminology, we talk about size of blocks, and it should be about 400 megabytes. And of course, it's a ballpark estimate, right? It could be higher or lower, but it will be needed at some point. And I do hope that by the time we get there, the hardware will be much better and so on, so it won't be prohibitive.
Okay.
So there will need to be more brute force increases in the block size and so on. There do need to be other scalability methods, but I think Lightning Network can go a long way, and it's pretty much necessary, but it does come with its own challenges, right? Many of the assumptions we make when we use on-chain Bitcoin are no longer true when we use Lightning, right? So there are many variations of this, but for example, in Bitcoin on-chain, you can accept payment when you're offline, right? If you give someone your Bitcoin address, then without asking you, he can send coins to that address. With Lightning Network, someone needs to be online to receive the payment. So that's a marked usability change. There's also the issue with the backups, right? So with on-chain Bitcoin, you have the seed from which all your private keys are generated deterministically. You store your seed once, and and you have backups for whatever you will have in the future. In Lightning Network, it doesn't work as well because you don't need just your keys, you need also the channel state. So the way backups will work will be different. Now, it's not a huge problem. There are solutions, and we can talk a lot about different solutions, but it is different. And, some people, some people think that Lightning Network means you just press a button and that's it. You can use Bitcoin like you wanted, but with infinite scalability, and that's not the case. So there are some costs, some challenges, some risks, and so on. But yeah, I think it's worth it because this really allows you to send payments instantly and without any fees and in any scale you want.
So maybe that's a segue to my next question. We have the Scaling Bitcoin conference attend here in Israel next month, right? And you're thinking of, or you're participating in the conference. So maybe you can tell us a bit about the research you've done in Bitcoin, the papers you've published over the years, and maybe a bit of what you're thinking of for the upcoming conference.
Okay, so I think probably my most famous research is on the topic of Bitcoin pool mining reward systems. So to understand that, I need to say a few words about mining pools. So people are mining. If someone mines solo on himself, it's a bit of a problem because he will only find a block once in a long time, and there's a lot of variance and risks and so on. So that's why people created mining pools. So a lot of miners are mining together and they split the rewards. So in order to do that, they need some method for how to split the rewards. And this turns out to be not as trivial as it sounds. And back when I entered the scene, so there were a few methods that are being used, some are better than others. So first I invented a few methods which in some ways are better than those that were used before. And I also wrote a pretty comprehensive paper detailing all the different methods that can be used, should be used, shouldn't be used, with the actual mathematical derivations of the features of each such method. So for a while back then, when I was also active in the international forums, Bitcoin Talk, and so on, so I was something of an authority in the issue of mining pool reward systems. So there's that. There's another paper of mine dealing with analysis of hash rate based double spending. So the idea, in Satoshi's original white paper, he did some calculations of what happens if someone with a significant amount of hash rate wants to do a double spending attack, reorg some branch of the blockchain and have a transaction that already has several confirmations, have it reversed. So I did some examples based on the percentage hash rate and the number of confirmations. What is the probability to succeed in reversing it? So I expanded on that. So I chose a model which is slightly more accurate than what Satoshi had in mind, and I did more comprehensive theoretical calculations and analysis and so on. So that forms a good basis to understand if I receive a payment and I waited for some number of confirmations and I can assume the attacker will not have more than a certain amount of hash rate, then this helps me assess the risks. So, I think it's an important paper theoretically. I wouldn't take it to the bank as it is for anything practical because there are a lot of things that could influence the results, but that was something we did.
And your current paper or your current work?
Okay, so my current work, which is still work in progress, I haven't completed all the research concerning it, is about a suggested change to the Bitcoin protocol, where the idea is to make the transaction fees more stable, right? So if you look at a graph like Joho's mempool website, you see a graph of how the transaction fees in Bitcoin go over time. and it's highly variable in both in long time periods and short time periods. So you can have, within a day, a period where you have to pay 100 satoshis per byte to get a transaction in, periods when you have 1 satoshi per byte, and right now it's still not too high because the blocks aren't that full. There isn't enough Bitcoin usage compared to the current limits. But if we have another growth part and and more people will use Bitcoin, then we will see the fees range from 1 satoshi per byte to 1,000 satoshis per byte. And in addition to the overall level of fees, so there is the problem of the average fee, which is a trade-off. The bigger the blocks, the lower the average fee, but more resources are needed for initial block download and so on. But the variability in the fees is it doesn't help anyone, right? If the fees are high, you could say, okay, it finances miners and it allows more compact blocks, but the variability in the fee doesn't help anyone, and it's a big problem for usability, right?
Okay, can you sum it up maybe in one or two sentences just to help?
So I want to help the Bitcoin fees be more stable and not change so much over time, so people can plan more properly. And the basic idea for the solution which has several variants, but the limit on the block size should be somewhat variable, and when there is higher demand, the block should be bigger, and when there is smaller demand, block should be smaller. There are several different ways to do it, but the idea is that if you do this, then the fees will be more stable.
Interesting. Actually, I have one question that popped out in my head that's not really something I planned. It's something else. You've maybe known in the local community for somebody who's very sparse with the Facebook likes that you give, right? Like there have been occasions in the past that you have liked a post on Facebook. I think I have received one of those likes maybe. Why do you, you're maybe one of the people who gives the most likes that I've known on Facebook. So why do you do that, do you think?
Okay, so actually, this is a good question with a very interesting answer. So I think it started out as a sort of, I don't know how to call it, well, for lack of a better word, lack of confidence in myself, because, okay, let's say I see some post or comment and so on, and let's say that I do like it, and I come to the decision whether to press the like button or not. Then what held me back then at least is that who am I to give a like? Why should I bother people with the fact that I like this post? So this was a kind of thought I had. It's completely irrational, obviously, but that's something of a holdback that I had back then. And over time, I got used to not giving likes, and it became, a thing, right?
Part of your brand, maybe.
Yeah. So over time, this, momentum kept it going, and also, and given that I don't give a lot of likes, I only want to give likes when there's something really special. So it's kind of a vicious circle.
It's like in Twitter, somebody said that you only follow Udi Wertheimer, right? So
mostly, I currently follow 4 people on Twitter. Mostly I trust that anything interesting Udi will retweet, so I don't need much more followees. But yes, so that's and actually in Twitter it's also interesting. It's also about managing expectations in my feed. So when I see something on my feed, so 90% it's because Udi wrote or retweeted it. So I know what to expect when I look at the feeds. Now, if I followed 100 or 1,000 people, then my feed would be a mix of all sorts of stuff, and they wouldn't know what to expect when I see it. And this, by the way, also depends on the fact that I think Twitter's format is a bit problematic. It's very difficult to follow conversations on Twitter. It's threads which split to other threads, and it's not clear where you are, and it's a big mess. So anything I can do to simplify it a bit, I prefer it. So that's about that.
Okay.
I think I have some more questions about the community, but first I want to get into your maybe main focus these days, which is the Israeli Bitcoin Association, if that is correct. So maybe I know that there's sometimes people on the community on Facebook don't really understand what it is that you do or what it is that the association or what does the IBA do. So maybe you want to explain, what is the day in the life of you when you're doing IBA work?
Okay, so that's difficult to answer because it changes a lot between day to day, but you can, and also it's maybe a bit difficult to delineate which part is actually the IBA and which part is just me acting as an individual. I mean, for me, everything I do I consider it a part of the IBA work, but something it's more complicated. But anyway, so a lot of my time is spent writing and helping people. So when I have something important to write, I write a paper about it or a post. But also I spend a lot on the Facebook group of the community, and I try to answer questions and comment and so on. And sometimes people ask me questions in private messages, and I try to answer that. So that takes a chunk of my time. But again, here it's not clear that it's actually the IBA's work. So another thing which I spend some time on is organizing events. So these come in all kinds of ways. So there is the weekly event, the Bitcoin Basics, which is every week we have a lecture dealing with some basic topic about Bitcoin, which is, I think, one of the IBA's more interesting projects. And we have managed to, give a lot of lectures in series, and they are very varied. There are maybe 20 different people that have given a talk on maybe 40 different topics. So even though we frame it as Bitcoin Basics, there are a lot of different things that you could talk about in this context. So I think that's interesting, and it requires some work, right? Also, with choosing the speakers and organizing the event itself. So there's that. There are also community gatherings where I also come both to be part of the community and also to be available for people coming into the embassy to ask questions. So there's that. There are also the occasional, more specific events, right? So you mentioned scaling Bitcoin, and in general, more events that are taking place there. So I'm not one of the main organizers for these events, but I am somewhat active and try to help them, which has to do both with, helping, depends on the event, but either planning the agenda or talking with potential sponsors and so on. So there's some chunk of time going to that. There are also events which are organic to the IBA. So for example, before Israel's last round of elections, we organized an event where we had a panel of potential members of the Knesset, where we allowed people to learn about the positions of the different candidates to help them make their election better. And of course, those elections are no longer relevant. We are facing another round of elections. We might do another event of this kind, maybe not, depends whether we can mobilize well enough. But so like I said, events are one thing. And this leads us to the issue of regulation. But before regulation, I will talk also about the press, which is another area of activity for the IBA, where we try to make Bitcoin be covered as much as possible and as well as possible in the Israeli mainstream media. So, by the way, here too, and also in many of the other things, I don't do it all myself, right? But, so for example, specifically with the With the media, we have a press consultant, which is a firm that does a lot of the work, but it also always requires some involvement from me, either to give interviews to reporters or to approve, press releases that we're putting out and so on. So there's some chunk of time with that. And with regulation, so that's a big thing, because that's one of the big challenges for Bitcoin all over the world, but specifically in Israel at this period of time. So the IBA and I do a lot of work related to regulation. So here too, we have our lawyers, we have our people managing the regulatory efforts, but also a lot of involvement for me is required, either to talk with regulators, either if it's members of the Knesset or people in the different government branches and so on. So I need to talk to them and explain about what Bitcoin is and why it's good and why we need their help to making it fulfill its potential. And also, there's a lot of, sometimes we send out letters or give our response to new regulations and so on. So in a lot of these things, it needs my involvement and my approval and so on. So there's that. And of course, I could talk more about any of these things, but these are the main directions, and there are probably a few that I forgot about.
Yeah, so that's a lot of work. That's a lot of that goes unseen and under the cover, maybe under the hood. I think maybe we'll try to pick up the pace a bit, because we still have a lot of questions. So I'll try maybe be a bit more concise, like 15%, 10%. So in the IBA, so what do you think would be your or is your biggest challenge in this role?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there are several different challenges.
If you have to pick one or two.
Well, I'm not sure, but yeah, I guess probably it would have to do with the regulation and actually making tangible process in this regard, because we have done a lot of work on regulation so far without big results that we can actually see. I mean, I consider it like, a big rock that you chisel, so we chisel more and more and more. I want to eventually get to the point where we see the completed work, but it still hasn't really happened. And in the end, you also mentioned the idea of how much the work is visible. So, on one hand, I try not to advertise our work too much, and I want to let the results speak for themselves. But so far in the regulation, the results aren't that great. So this is kind of a challenge to see that all the work is eventually paying off.
So you're as I said, we're working on the IBA for a long time now, right? And you've given a lot of funding. It's not a secret that you've given a lot of funding to it, and in your personal time. So I don't know what is the IBA's runway in terms of how many years it can last, like funding-wise, I guess. But I think maybe a more interesting question, you've been doing all of this pro bono, right? Just for altruistic purposes. But what has the, I don't know, has there been a negative impact of this work on you? What's the price that you pay for doing all this work?
Well, I'm not sure how much I want to go into that, but I will say that it's probably not okay. So the reason I spend all of my time working pro bono and also donate money, so that's because I can, right? If I couldn't do it, I wouldn't do it. I can spend all my time working pro bono, and a lot of people are not in that situation, and I think it changes my perspective a bit, because a lot of people think in the mentality of how to put bread on the table, how to do work which will actually benefit them financially because they have to. And I'm not in the position where I need to worry about these things. So it's a bit, it changes the perspective in a bit ways. And in some ways, I barely remember what it's like to actually need to work for a living. So I think it's So that's one cost where my perspective is changing, and not necessarily in a good way.
So a disconnect, let's say, for most of the people.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah, and okay. And I will mention is that everyone who does work, I guess, does expect some kind of payment, but payment can be in many forms. It can be actual money. It can be satisfaction in the achievements. It can be the appreciation for people around you. So yes, so I for a long time have not worked for actual payment, but what I feed off is the
Recognition.
the recognition and the appreciation and the sense of achievement. And it's not always clear to me that people actually do appreciate my work. And like I said, with regards to achievement, we did accomplish some achievements, but not nearly as much as I would have wanted. So there is a bit of a tension there.
So do you, that's maybe my final question on this topic. So do you consider the IBA a success story? Like, is it easier now in 2019 to work with crypto than 2017? Or?
Well, I think the IBA has a lot of positive impact. Compared to the expectations we had back in 2013 when we started it, I think I wouldn't call it a success story. I mean, I think it didn't meet our expectations, both with the actual impact and achievements and with how the IBA itself works. So, I'm not sure what exactly was your vision back then, but I had some vision of how the IBA is supposed to work and how it's supposed to be perceived. And I'm not sure we got that to that point. Maybe we will in the future, I don't know. But so far it's not working exactly as intended. And again, with respect to impact, it did have impact, not as much as I would have wanted. So it's not a success story, it's not a failure story.
It's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
So and like what do you think? Like, I know that personally I ran into, me and a lot of other people have ran into the Israeli regulatory system and banking system, and I think that we have somewhat of a unique situation here compared to other Western countries. Like, it's very difficult here to work with banks and buy or sell crypto. Why do you think Israel is maybe the only Western country where it's so difficult to operate, despite the efforts that we're doing, of course?
Yeah, well, okay. So first, it is true that it's more difficult in Israel than in a lot of other places. I don't know exactly to what extent, right? I haven't been personally out of Israel in the past 5 years, and I also haven't lived anywhere else and so on. So I don't know exactly how it's like in other countries. I believe they also have their own challenges. But it does seem that Israel is harder. And I don't know exactly, but I think it's a part of a kind of maybe paradox in Israel, where on the one hand, we have a lot of startups and innovation and entrepreneurship and so on. So it's a very advanced country in that respect. But I think with regulation in general, Israel is not so progressive, right? We see it in a lot of different aspects, not necessarily Bitcoin, but regulation here, I think, is a bit slow to adapt and very strict in some cases. So I think there is something, I don't know what exactly it is, but something that causes regulation in Israel in general to be a bit problematic and slower to adapt.
Okay. Yeah, so of course, as this developed, you were doing, the IBA is doing some efforts for that, and other people are doing some efforts to try and change that, and hopefully in a few years, things will be a bit different. So I want to switch to the topic of community, which is maybe tied to the the IBA, but it's a bit different. Can you maybe say in a few 2-3 minutes on how the Israeli community has developed over the years, has evolved since the very early days? That meetup of 2-3 people to what we have today?
Yes. So I think in general, the size of what we would call a community, follows or correlates more or less with, the Bitcoin price and hyperaudience and so on. So when, when there's a lot of interest in Bitcoin, more people take an active involvement in the community than in other times. So I think, you could talk about it in the sense of the different layers of community, right? So you have the most hardcore activists, and you have additional layers of people active in some way. And, I think the hardcore community has been relatively static for the past few years. I mean, there are a few people you think about as the main activists in Israel that promote it. So, this also reminds me of the meetup we did back in the day called Meet the Activists, where we had such a, sort of a queue of people talking very briefly about what they did. So I think if you look at the names from back then and the names that are active right now, there is a lot of overlap. It's not complete. There are some new people. There are people who went into other things. So, but I do think there is a hardcore which is more or less persistent, and in the other layers, it's it's pretty dynamic. So you could talk about different aspects of the community. So one of the indicators might be social gatherings at the Bitcoin embassy, which is maybe a bit Tel Aviv-centric, because people are not in Tel Aviv, have a harder time getting there. But we have, of course, the weekly community gathering, which we call Satoshi Square, every Sunday evening. And you can see, fluctuations in how many people come there. And right now, it's not a lot of people, right? There were times where more people came. I guess a lot of the people in the community get burned out at some point. So, they have the initial period where they come in and they're very excited about Bitcoin and they want to be part of the community. They want to talk with other like-minded people. And yeah, but for many of them, this urge subsides after a while, and you remain with the hardcore. Yes, so yeah.
There was also a split. Some of the split in the community. I think it was about a year ago, right? In the Facebook groups. At what point did you realize that there was no other way but to split the community or the group?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it splitting the community. That's actually maybe a slightly different perspective I have than some other people. I don't think the Facebook group in itself is a community. I think the Facebook group is a tool for the community to get in touch with one another. So even though there was a split in the Facebook groups, I think the community is what it is, and each person chooses where to be. And so this was a somewhat diplomatic phrase. I do, of course, believe that the real group is the real group that people should use, and I think it's harmful for the community that people stick with the older group. But
so when did you realize that the split was necessary?
Okay, so so it was basically after I spent a lot of effort trying to find some solution with, in collaboration with the admin of the old group, and we didn't get to a solution which is satisfactory to the whole community, right? So there were, 50 or more community activists which, tried to resolve the problem, and we didn't, there were some, how do you call it, deal breakers that were important for how to resolve the situation. And and the solution we eventually managed to agree with the old admin was not satisfactory for the people involved. And that's when it was clear that there needs to be a new group. Like I said, I did hope that it will not be so much of a split, as a transition to a new group with, a more democratic set of admins. It's not completely democratic. That's also impossible to do on Facebook. But a group based on the needs of the actual community and with proper management and so on. So I did hope that everyone transitioned to that. But that apparently was a bit naive, I guess. So, the new group is very successful, but a lot of people stick with the old group, which I think is unfortunate. I'm not even sure I ever discussed this in public, but I think it would be much better to the community to have, a clear move, right? So if everyone moves to the new group and the old group is forgotten, then we have a group for the community where everyone is in it and it can enjoy a better management.
Yeah, but it's hard to make 20,000 people move.
But you have to keep in mind that 30,000 is not necessarily 30,000 because most of them are probably people who are no longer actually interested. I mean, the old group got those numbers towards the end of 2017, where there was a lot of hype. A lot of people are no longer involved. So but I was hoping that with enough work this can be done, and that's why I was hoping that the community activists would support it, right? So if 100% of the main community activists switch, then everyone else will follow because we'll have good content there and not there. But when only 80% switch and 20%, let's say, play it on both sides, then it's not clear that we've made a transition, and then everyone else will also, it's not be clear that they need to move, right? So I think there should be one major group for Facebook in Israel. There can be many satellite groups focusing on different topics and so on, but I think there's a lot of value in one group where everyone is and everyone knows that everyone is.
Right now it's not really clear if there is such one group because, at least, especially for somebody new coming in, they go to Facebook, they type Bitcoin in Hebrew, and it's not really clear what group to follow, or maybe they go to the wrong or old group.
So that also has a lot to do with deficiencies in the Facebook search algorithms. So now, in addition to the problem with the old Facebook group, which are very serious, there's also the issue of fake groups that change their name so they will match exactly the name of some existing group, and the people sometimes accidentally go there instead of the real group, whether it's the old one or the new. And there is a fake group with the name of the old group and the fake group with the name of the new group, and it's really messy. So there are issues with the Facebook algorithms. So like I said, I do think people should come to where most of the knowledge is, right? So if
but they can't really know because they don't know.
So that's why I want Facebook's algorithms to understand that the new group is better, and that's why I wanted the activists to choose correctly, right? So if all the people who publish quality content would go to the new group, then eventually Facebook will also realize that there's more activity and more content and so on in the new group, and then the algorithms will follow.
Okay.
So far it hasn't really happened. So I think of it of something like pulling out a band-aid, right? So if it's tempting to write in the old group because allegedly there's more people there, even though I'm not sure that's true, because if you look at activity, I think there's more activity in the new group, but it does look like there is a lot of activity in the old group. So if you write in the old group, you may be able to enjoy in the short term because you get more exposure.
But you're part of the problem.
You're part of the problem, and in the long term, it's harmful for the community. It takes us a step farther from having a new unified group where the whole community is in. So that's about that. Like I said, I think it's the first time I've discussed all of this in public, and I did intend to be more active in trying to move people to the new group later after we're done with scaling Bitcoin and so on. And if I would have done that, I would have, thought more about how I phrased the whole thing. So maybe this didn't come out so good, but that's how I view this thing, and I hope things will be okay.
Okay. I want to get maybe a bit more personal. You mentioned before that, you said it yourself. You don't really need to work anymore, right? So, maybe you can classify you as wealthy. So, how did you personally handle the 10,000x that Bitcoin did since you first invested in it? And did it change your lifestyle? What are the effects?
Well, it didn't change my lifestyle so much. I mean, other than the fact that I don't have to work, so I spend all of my time voluntarily. I don't think there were any significant changes. I mean, there are some, I'm lighter on the trigger when I want to buy something, and
You're lighter now, you say?
yeah.
Lighter, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I guess it's a complicated question, but I don't think my lifestyle has changed too much.
Do you find any downside to having more money?
Not so much, not that I can think of right now. Let's see.
There's even a saying, right, in Hebrew, more money, more worries, or...
Yeah, כן, הרבה נכסים, הרבה דאגה. Yes, so maybe, but yeah, I think it's overall speaking a good development.
Okay. And have you run into, when you're trying to turn some of this wealth in the form of bitcoins to fiat, to shekels, have you run into any issues yourself with the Israeli taxing system or banking system? How do you deal with that?
I have run into issues, mostly with the banking system. And, I managed to find a solution working for my current needs. But if in the future my needs will change, then it will not be sufficient, and we need to work on new solutions. And it's also interesting to note about that there were some steps I started taking to maybe improve this situation, right? For example, I started the process for opening a bank account overseas and things like that, but I never completed this process because I was so flooded with the work I'm doing with the IBA. So I haven't really spent a lot of time dealing with these issues unless I really had to. And you could say that in addition to all the other costs of my work, there's also the indirect costs of I'm too focused on the IBA work that I don't spend enough time, doing what I think is for my own personal finances. And it is important to mention here that if I really wanted that, I could probably do this and that. But if you talk in terms of energy and focus, and if, for example, I start my day and I can do some work on my personal finances, I think I can do some work related to the IBA, especially if there is something pressing going on, then I will always gravitate towards the IBA work. So it's part of it is because I don't manage my time so as I should, but it is a real problem. And yeah,
it can be tough. A lot of people are workaholics in a way, or tend to gravitate towards that, and it can be hard balancing that out. Even when you're, or especially when you're not getting paid for that. I have a question from Ofer Rotem, one of the partners of in Collider VC. He asked before this interview, what is your investment thesis for crypto startups or blockchain startups?
Okay, so for the most part, I don't have a thesis, but if I have to maybe make one up, I invest in startups. Okay, in general, I don't invest that much in startups. I did in the past invest in several, but I'm trying, okay, so trying to look for directions that I think are positive and further solution to challenges that we have.
In Bitcoin, you mean?
So yes, so in general, I think I only invested ever in Bitcoin-related startups. So, anything which is not in that category, I don't really look at so much.
And blockchain startups that don't involve Bitcoin?
Yes, so, okay, so first, Bitcoin is not just Bitcoin, right? Actually, this opens a whole new can of worms with regards to Bitcoin, blockchain, maximalism, and so on. So I might say a few words about that in a moment, but it is confined to the Bitcoin space for some definition of the Bitcoin space. I want to see that it's a good direction. I want to see that the entrepreneurs are reasonable, that they are good people, and so on. And if they do, I can invest. I don't consider so much the business model and the things like that, because getting something out of the investment is a consideration, but it's not the main consideration. So I try to look more at how the idea is going to help the world, less on whether it will be actually profitable and so on. So that's the main ideas, I guess. Now, yeah, so maybe I'll say a few words about blockchain and so on. So I do think that Bitcoin's technology can be applied for other things than just currency. I have thought that since 2012, back when I wrote a paper about colored coins, which I think is a term you coined.
Yeah?
I think so, yes. So I think the technology can be used. And and I am in favor of trying to find uses for the technology beyond just a currency or just Bitcoin. However, I'm not convinced that or at least I think that a large majority of what is going on right now with the field of blockchain is not, it doesn't have any basis. It's just hype and buzz and so on. And it does change a bit over time, but even now, I still think a lot of people say the word blockchain as if it's a magic word, or I like to call it a magic powder that you sprinkle on something, becomes better. So that's the main idea that is going on right now. So when this happens, and even if it could potentially be used for good, you have to be very skeptical about anything you hear which mentions blockchain. So that's why I usually try to avoid, because with Bitcoin we understand exactly what it is, why it's good, how it works, why it needs a blockchain, and so on. So it's much more productive to be active in that space, where you try to generalize, then you have to deal with 99% of things which are not good, and I don't think it's a very effective focus.
Okay.
So that's why I am skeptical of anything like that. But I did, I did also invest in more than one startup that really generalizes and uses the blockchain for other things. So it's not, I don't rule it out, but it's a bit more suspicious, everything which is not Bitcoin. And when it is Bitcoin, then you know that usually there's something good about it. And and another aspect here is the Bitcoin versus other digital currencies, Litecoin, Ethereum, and so on. It depends on what you include in the scope, right? I mean, Udi has the famous question, what is crypto, right? So it's not clear what each term should denote. But even if we focus on currencies, the question is whether there are good currencies other than Bitcoin. And my stance on it is that there could be, right? There is no, rule from above that says only Bitcoin can ever be a good currency. There can be other good currencies, and I think it's good to have competition between different currencies. And and I think there is room for more innovation and trying to do things differently than how it's Bitcoin. So so there can be good currencies. I'm not convinced that there currently are, right? If you look at all the alts that currently exist, I'm not very bullish on either of them.
So you wouldn't necessarily invest in them. You may hold some, but you just don't bother cleaning them up, I guess. Or
So that my investment portfolio is a separate question. But yeah, I think I do want my portfolio to be a bit more diversified than just Bitcoin. But in a more conceptual level, I think that we are still waiting for a good currency that will actually compete with Bitcoin. And of course, it's also not bullion. There are better coins and worse coins. But right now, it's safer to focus on Bitcoin because also the incentives there are much better. When you have an alt, you don't know if it's an actually serious effort to innovate or just someone trying to pump and up and so on. So it's like I said, even though there can be good opportunities elsewhere, it's safer to stay with Bitcoin. Then you know that it's something good.
okay, I have a question here about how your investments have been doing over the years, but I have a suspicion that you don't really know that you invest. You said you'll invest a lot just to help and not really track that all that meticulously.
You're talking here more about altcoins or companies?
Either.
Well, with respect to altcoins, I don't know. With respect to companies, I also don't really know. I'm pretty much a hands-off investor. I mean, I give funds one, and then for all I care, they don't need to talk with me anymore. But I think, the companies that I've invested in, for the most part, are successful. They are progressing. I'm not sure if in monetary terms the investment has increased, but most of the companies are successful. I do okay. So one thing that does bother me sometimes is that usually I invest in companies in the phase of convertible notes, right before they have a round with an actual valuation, and this means that very often I invested in some company, got convertible notes. 2 years later, they are pretty much successful, and I think to myself, okay, I invested so early, and they've succeeded. I should get a nice return, but because it's just a convertible note, the best I get is some discount on the conversion to shares. So that's disappointing sometimes. But mostly I don't think too much about these things.
Okay. So I think I have a few more questions just to round up the interview on other topics, and then we'll conclude. So first, what are some other interests that you have outside the realm of Bitcoin and crypto?
Okay, so first we have my also professional vocation, which is mathematics and things like that. I've loved mathematics since I was very young, and of course I studied for a master's degree there, and I still either do or learn mathematics recreationally. I don't have a lot of time to spend on that, but it's something I am very interested in. I'm also known as something of a chess player. I'm not a good chess player, but I also spend some time playing chess. I enjoy programming occasionally. I'm also, lately I've been somewhat interested in things related to space and figuring out new ways to launch to space more efficiently. I hope to be in space sometime in my life for some definition of space. I mean, ideally I would be able to walk on the moon and so on, but maybe just visiting some space stations.
I guess there must be some version of Moore's law that applies to the cost of space travel as well.
So it's a complicated topic. I spent some time researching some non-traditional ways to launch to space. So right now, space launches are done using rockets, and there have been a decrease in cost in that. But in order to have really cheap space travel, you can't rely on rockets. There's a lot of problems with that. Probably the ideal solution is something called an orbital ring, which I will say a few words about because it's interesting, right? The idea is to have a ring which orbits around Earth, and it's spinning faster than what it would need to be in orbit, but there is another layer above it which is static and held with magnets, and this outer layer is being pulled to Earth, and the extra speed of the inner ring towards, together with the non-movement of the outer ring, creates exactly the same force. And what you get eventually is an object in space which is static, and from there you can pull down elevators, so things like that. And once you do that, you can just take an elevator and climb up to the orbital ring. I guess it should be about a height of 100 kilometers or maybe 200 kilometers. So that's something which, it's a huge project. I hope to see it in my lifetime. Probably that wouldn't happen, but when it happens, it will be very interesting.
So you're not a big believer in life extension?
Okay, so, I thought about it as I was saying. I am somewhat of a believer. I think the whole problem of aging and death and so on should be solved and will be solved eventually for some definition of solved. So it is a thing. Of course, there's also cryonics, which allows you to, to preserve yourself until such time that life is really being extended. But I'm somewhat interested. I'm not completely bullish, specifically not with the current timelines. So, someone who freezes himself right now, it's not clear that we will ever be able to restore it. And, the idea being is that the more advanced we are, the better we can preserve someone, the better his chances are. So it's something I am somewhat bullish about, but not so much at this point of time. Myself, I haven't signed up to any cryonics program so far, but maybe I will.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are some projects that or fields that interest you. But what are some other projects like that you see yourself putting time into? Like right now, it seems that you're pretty swamped. But maybe in the future, when you have some more time that aren't related to Bitcoin, do you have any dreams you want to pursue?
Well, I have some ideas, but we'll need to figure out this in the future. I don't have any concrete plans now.
Okay. A question from one of the audience from before. So, was there ever a time that you reverted a decision that you made? Right? Because that was the question as he phrased pretty much.
Wait, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So, was there ever a time that you reverted a decision that once you've reached it?
I have some idea of who might have asked this, but I guess you could say yes. I mean, it's pretty general. It did happen probably several times, but
you would say that mostly like once you reach a decision that you were pretty that has some momentum with you.
Maybe. I mean, I guess it's. I don't know if I can quantify it exactly. I mean, what happens very frequently is that I make a decision and then regret it. Whether I then go to revert it, it's something that can happen. Actually, I do think that philosophically, it's okay to revert decisions. I think that if you make a mistake and you realize that it's a mistake, I do think you need to try to correct it. And if the correction is in the form of reverting the decision, I think it should be done. And you don't need to, care so much about sunk costs or things like that and say, oh, okay, I already decided, so that's it.
But do you remember a case where you did it?
Well, there are cases when I did revert. There are cases when I didn't revert. I don't particularly want to talk about any of them.
Okay. So maybe just a few more questions. What is the biggest challenge that you successfully faced or your biggest achievement?
I'm not completely sure. I don't know.
So if I had to answer that question, I would say that what we have here in Israel and the IBA and the community, a lot of that is thanks to you. So at least in my book, that counts as a major achievement.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah. And you're, from what I've noticed, I've known you for a long time, you're one of the most honest people, or one of the people with more integrity that I've known.
Trying to be, yeah.
Have you always been this way? Do you know how you got this, or where you got this from?
That's a good question. I think I've always been this way, though maybe when I was much younger, I wasn't as much, so it did develop a bit eventually, but I think I always valued honesty and integrity and so on. So yeah, I'm not sure what intelligent things I can say about that, but yeah, I think I've always tried to be a good person. I think it's valuable. I think more people should be good people, and it's different people have different opinions on what it means to be a good person. I'm sure most people think of themselves as good people, even though they might not be perceived as such by others. But yeah, I try to be good, so that's, yeah.
So I was actually going to ask the last question, but I just have to ask another one, and then, so my second to last question is, what is your relationship with God and religion?
Okay, so that is a good question. So I come from a secular family. Most of my life, actually by now I'm not sure it's most of my life, but a lot of my life I hated religion and so on, and wasn't connected to it in any way. This changed when my brother became religious, Chazar B'Tshuva. So he, it was a process for him as well, but he shared with us a lot of the things he learned and so on. And the first thing I noticed is, before we even ask whether this is all true, I found that this is all very interesting, right? So we would sit at dinners, and he would tell us things from the halacha, from Midrash Haggadah, and so on, and it was very interesting. So I wanted to learn more. And
do you consider yourself a believer?
So no, I wouldn't say so. I mean, let's put it this way.
Because I've noticed, like, a lot of the meetings you go to, you don't do it in Shabbat, and
So with respect to belief, I'm not a big believer, but I do, in many occasions, behave as if I believe. I mean, this is part. I mean, I haven't ruled out completely the possibility that Judaism is true. I don't ascribe to it a lot of probability, but I do think maybe there is a chance that it's true, and I guess to some degree it's similar to Pascal's wager, but there's that. But also I think that sometimes this belief in belief strengthens me internally. So for example, sometimes I pray to God, and it's not necessarily that I believe that he exists and he will do what I ask, but the actual prayer itself, I feel that it gives me internal powers. So there's that. And also, with putting aside completely the question of belief, there are the questions of the culture and the tradition and so on. So I do find myself connected to the Jewish tradition. And so for example, I observe many of the things related to specific holidays and so on. So this is to a large part because I enjoy it. I enjoy being part of that. And also, of course, for me, because of the family relations, I mean, it would be much more challenging for me to have a good relationship with my brother if I didn't feel somewhat connected to this whole issue. So I am somewhat connected to religion, not so much because of belief, but more because I like being part of that. That's the main idea.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of the practice of giving gratitude for something, just is similar to prayer, and gives a lot to the one who's doing it. So my final question here is, who would you be interested in? Who should I interview next? Who would you be interested to watch an interview with? It can be in Israel or outside, but my focus currently is in Israel.
Yes, so that's a good question. I probably would not watch it myself, even if you did, whoever.
Satoshi.
Say, but yeah, that's of course would be interesting. But you know, actually, I'm not even sure. Remember all the people you have interviewed yet. But you know, maybe wait. Was Udi with you already?
Yeah, I did an interview with
so
Udi.
yeah. So there is one possibility. Nadav Ivgi is another great possibility.
Yep.
Who else? Yeah, you know, I apologize in advance for all the people I'm not talking about. They're good people, but yeah, I think Nadav would be very interesting. Other than that,
Yeah, I actually asked him, and so far he refused. But maybe in the future we'll agree. Okay. So thank you very much for joining me here, and thank you guys for watching this. Again, if you want to be notified of further interviews, then please just write me an email or subscribe to the channel, and we will see you again in the next interview. My next interview will be sometime next month, I think, with Ofer Rotem. I will post an announcement later. Thank you.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.